So welcome everyone to the April session of the Paul Miller Washington Reporting Fellowship. We are very excited today to introduce Director of CISA, Jen Easterly. Director Easterly has been Director of CISA since 2021. Her background, she's got a fascinating background going back to West Point. My fun fact, my aunt was actually the first woman to graduate from a U.S. military academy, which was only less than 10 years before Director Easterly. And so you can imagine what West Point was like in the 80s, and I'm sure that you have lots of stories to tell. She was also an intelligence officer in Iraq and Afghanistan. She is here today to talk about, she can answer your questions on anything from Shields Up to election security. It is, I'm sure, going to be one of those conversations where you leave saying, wow, that was fascinating and terrifying. So with that, please join me in welcoming Director Easterly.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So I figured I'd just talk a little bit about what I do, but then open it up for questions because you all are reporters, and give you an opportunity to spend most of the time talking about what you all want to talk about. So it's great to be here. It's a really cool program. I was reading a little bit about it and reading some of your backgrounds. So I noticed you were all described as young-ish, which I don't know what the definition of young-ish is, but it's great that you're starting off in your career and to do this fellowship program. So really cool. So I've been in this job for almost 2 years, July of 2021. And it was my first time in the Department of Homeland Security. I actually spent most of my career in the U.S. Army, started out at West Point, was a tactical intelligence officer, and then spent a bit of time at the National Security Agency, was at the White House twice. And then after I left the White House the second time, I went to the private sector to work for Morgan Stanley, running their cybersecurity operations program. So came back to lead CISA, which, as you probably know, is the newest agency in the federal government. Stood up at the end of 2018 to be America's cyber defense agency. So our mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And when you say critical infrastructure, sometimes people's eyes glaze over when you think about infrastructure. That's like, oh, infrastructure, that's boring stuff. But when we say critical infrastructure, it's really just water and power and transportation and communications and healthcare and education, basically all the things that we rely upon to run our lives on a daily basis. And so our job is to protect and defend all of those networks and those systems. But the thing is that most of those networks, in fact, the vast majority of those networks and systems are all owned by the private sector. So the extra challenge is figuring out how we really develop these trusted partnerships with critical infrastructure owners and operators across the country so that we can be effective in our mission, which is very different from other government jobs that I had in the White House sit room. You spend hundreds of hours sitting, doing policy work in the Army, downrange in the field, whether that's Haiti or Bosnia or Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, or at the NSA, where you're doing really interesting stuff, but you're doing it in closed spaces and in compartmented facilities, and so you're not interacting with your customers per se, or the folks that you're working with, your partners. And it's a great thing about this job is I spend probably about 70 to 80% of my time with industry, with state and local colleagues, with academia, with researchers, and it's really fun to be able to have those conversations directly to get that feedback on the kind of things we're working on at CISA, but also to engage to build that trust that is so important for us to be effective in our mission. So we've been doing a lot over the past 2 years. You mentioned Shields Up, which was part of the campaign that we started a little over a year ago in anticipation of potential Russian retaliatory cyber threats on our critical infrastructure, given the unified effort to impose costs for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've been focused on standing up something we call the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which is the center of gravity for bringing together partners across the federal government, across industry, across the international community, as well as state and local, to get a full picture of the threat environment so that we can drive down risk to the nation. So we've spent a lot of time doing that. And then we've spent time really trying to refine the type of products and advisories and alerts that we put out to the community to make sure that we really can drive down risk to the nation in a world that is very more complex, more dynamic than it's ever been. The last thing I'd point to, I think we sent out a foreign affairs article that a colleague of mine recently wrote about a sustainable approach to cybersecurity. And it's really looking at three primary things. First of all, a focus on technology safety. Second, a focus on corporate cyber responsibility. So CEOs and boards really embracing cyber risk as a matter of good governance. And then finally, what we call persistent collaboration, which is a recognition that we've been talking about this thing called public-private partnership for decades. And it had become rather hackneyed of a concept. And so we really wanted to shift the paradigm to something where we recognize that government and industry need to be in constant communication and real-time sharing of information in a way that we could come together and reduce risk to the nation. So really about putting collaboration over self-preservation, because we recognize in a world that's highly connected, highly vulnerable, that we all need to work together for the good of the nation. So I'm happy to talk about my career path, anything I've done, what we do at CISA, anything else on your mind. So over to you all.
Hi, I'm Naomi with the Washington Examiner. I'm sort of curious about, you sort of mentioned the threats that are happening because of the Ukraine war. I mean, has there been like a heightened security threat toward the US since the start of the invasion? And then also, are you working with Ukraine to help them sort of bolster their security as well when it comes to cybersecurity and attacks against their critical infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the first one, you know, it's a standard part of the Russian playbook to perpetrate malicious cyber activities. Certainly, we saw that in Ukraine going back to the invasion of Crimea. We saw a lot of attacks on the power systems, and we were very concerned early on about potential retaliatory attacks in the US on our critical infrastructure. So, you know, even towards the end of 2021, we started briefing all of the critical infrastructure sectors at the top secret level, the secret level, and the unclassified level, talking to governors and mayors and Homeland Security advisors about the potential threat, what we could expect, what they might do, tactics based on what we'd seen before. And then we started that Shields Up campaign. You might remember in March of last year, the president actually came out and made a statement about potential threats based on intelligence against our critical infrastructure. And frankly, I'm surprised that we have not seen attacks against critical infrastructure at home. And I often get asked, well, why haven't we seen anything? And, you know, it's hard to tell. It's hard to get in the mind of Putin, but I think there's a couple things to think about. First, I think there were a lot of miscalculations that were made. Miscalculation in expecting that it would be a cakewalk to Kiev and essentially it would be an easy, quick victory. I think the second miscalculation was that the US and the global community wouldn't be as unified as they were in terms of imposing costs and going in to support Ukraine with equipment and funds. I think they did correctly escalate, given some of the warnings that the president had given to Putin in the summer of 2021, that a specific strike on our critical infrastructure would be highly escalatory. So I think they've held off on that for now. I also think they've been very, very busy in Ukraine, even though we very much focus on the kinetic activity because it is so horrific. There's been a lot of cyber activity against Ukraine critical infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. I think the key lesson for us is that resilience matters. So the Ukrainians have been attacked in cyber for almost 10 years now, and they've built up their defenses, they've built up their talent, their capabilities. and they've built up their resilience. So while there have been a lot of strikes, they've really been able to withstand them. And that's been a great lesson learned for us. Also, the importance of that collaboration. It goes to your second question, Naomi. We have tremendous partnerships with our international partners. We play a role called US CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team. It's the sort of America's Cyber Defense Agency. So we have those, or we already had those relationships. So we were working with Ukraine CERT even before there was any thought or any knowledge of an invasion. And so we had those good relationships. And we have really strengthened that connective tissue with Ukraine over the past year and a half. And we've signed an MOU with their cyber defense agency that's about more information sharing, best practices, as well as capacity building. So helping to provide training in particular on what we call operational technology or industrial control systems. We actually just had a meeting last week to move out on forward progress on the memorandum of understanding. The other thing that's been really good is we've been really helping to lean into our partnerships with the Eastern European nations who are also seeing a lot of activity. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. And that's helped us understand some of the tactics and techniques and what we call indicators of compromise. So think of that as signatures of adversary activity that we can then proactively put in advisories of alerts that go out to our critical infrastructure owners and operators so that they can proactively prevent any of these incursions on our critical infrastructure. So I think, it's been a very obviously horrific situation in Ukraine, but a lot of good learnings that I think will help build our own resilience here in the U.S.
Hi, Matthew Troy with the Texas Tribune. I wanted to ask, there've been a lot of wake-up calls and also, opportunities for better addressing cybersecurity from the colonial pipeline to, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what have you. Do you feel that Congress has adequately taken up that call, whether in, IIJA or the IRA, or do you think that they've just kind of left it on the wayside for, sexier priorities like climate and like oil and gas development?
Are you saying that cyber is not sexy? I beg to differ. No, just kidding. No, actually, I think a couple things. First of all, I've been incredibly encouraged by the nature of the bipartisan support that we have for cybersecurity. So, I came into this job in July. I was still at Morgan Stanley when SolarWinds happened. And off the back of SolarWinds, there was $650 million given through the American Rescue Plan Act to CISA for us to make significant improvements on how we manage the .gov. So it's called the Federal Civilian Executive Branch, the FCEB, and that's 100 plus departments and agencies that are essentially the .gov. And so there was a real lack of visibility in terms of understanding what was happening on those networks, which is why it took a while to fully understand the impacts of SolarWinds. But that was the first time that the Congress came together after a major incident to really make sure that we had the right authorities to be able to manage the FCEB as an enterprise. We didn't have that before. We didn't have that level of visibility, and we've made significant strides since then. But even before then, has anyone heard of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission? So this was a commission that was set up, I think, in 2018. It was a bipartisan congressional commission. It was chaired by Angus King, senator from Maine, and Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin. And then it had experts both from government as well as industry. And it was sort of set up with a goal of defining the cyber strategy that we need going into the next 50 to 100 years. And if you're at all interested in technology or cybersecurity specifically, I would take a look at it because, there are a lot of commissions that the government sets up. I think only two really made a big difference, at least in my lifetime. One was the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. The second was the 9/11 Commission, which I also had some involvement in. But the Cyberspace Solarium Commission had about 75, I think, recommendations. And of those 75 recommendations, they all came with legislation actually written. The bills were all written out, which allowed them to provide that information to Congress. And then you had Congress people who were part of the commission. And so 40 or so recommendations were actually taken up and instantiated in legislation. And many of those we benefited from CISA. So when I came into the job, we received new authorities from Congress that really helped build our capability, which was great. And then to your point about Colonial Pipeline, which is interesting because it's been almost 2 years, I think it was May 1st. A lot of things came out of that. First, increased awareness across that community. You could argue that from a regulatory standpoint, TSA is what we call the Sector Risk Management Agency, also the regulator for pipelines, put in place some more stringent security directives. So more standards in cyber that we're demanding of pipelines. We actually worked with pipeline companies to help them implement detection technology. So if there were potential issues, as we saw with Colonial Pipeline, they would be able to detect it earlier. And then I would argue that the most important thing coming out of Colonial Pipeline was CIRCIA. Has anyone heard of CIRCIA? It's the Critical Infrastructure Reporting or Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. And it's really important because they've been trying to get this mandatory reporting regime for probably over a decade. And what it says is that critical infrastructure owners and operators have to report a significant cyber incident within 72 hours. So right now, so we're going through this rulemaking process, but right now, there's no obligation for companies that get hit to report into the federal government. There's regimes depending on what regulation exists across the various critical infrastructure sectors. So when I was in finance, there was some reporting that was necessary, but it's sort of a patchwork. It's kind of a mosaic that doesn't fit together. So for the first time, we'll be able to have more visibility into the cyber attacks and intrusions that are happening across the technology ecosystem. And one of the important things to think about with this legislation, it wasn't created to be punitive. It wasn't created to name or shame or hurt a reputation or to stab the wounded. It was created essentially so that we could help with response, but also so we could take that information and get it out more broadly, protecting the privacy and anonymity of the entity, but get that out more broadly so we could say, hey, it looks like there's a major campaign using these types of techniques. Time to go shields up and make sure that your infrastructure is supported and protected. So I think that's one of the things that is most significant. And again, that was bipartisan legislation. So I've been really encouraged. It remains to be seen how things go. But even just in the first hearing that's been held at the cyber subcommittee of the House Homeland, that was generally a very bipartisan approach, and I'll be testifying there at the end of the month. It's Congressman Garbarino from New York and Congressman Swalwell from California, and I think they're both very focused on what they can do to help continue to move the ball. And I just had my budget hearing last week, and that was generally a good experience because I think folks understand that this is not an area to underinvest in for the nation, given all the threats out there.
Before we go to the next question in the room, James Levinson, who is our fellow with Fox News, he is in Ukraine right now. He submitted a few questions. I'll just go with his top one. He says, Cybercom has mentioned that they are increasingly focused on going on the offensive when it comes to cyber, a change from their posture in the past. How do you think that will affect CISA in the near future? And do you keep in contact with military commanders?
Yeah. So we are in probably daily contact, certainly with Cybercom and with the Cyber National Mission Force. We have liaisons at CISA with us, and then we have liaisons up at the fort. So it's a very, very good relationship, and part of that is because we built the infrastructure. Part of it is because we have very good relationships. So I was at NSA and helped actually stand up Cybercom in the 2009-2010 timeframe. So know the commander up there very well, and so we are very focused on making sure that we are taking advantage to the kind of things that they are doing. Typically with what they call their hunt forward missions. So at the request of a partner, they will go forward they will physically move forward to that country. They will operate on their network looking for adversary activity. When they find adversary activity, whether that's tactics or whether that's malware, then that gets passed back to us, and then we can actually use that to ensure that critical infrastructure knows about that malware and can be protected against it. So we actually call that the offense-defense flywheel. And we work very closely to ensure that we are taking advantage both of what they're seeing, and then they're taking advantage of what we're seeing, whether it's on the .gov or what we're getting in from our critical infrastructure partners. The other authority that came with the NDAA in 2021, that was another recommendation from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, was called the Joint Cyber Planning Office. We called it the JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And it's the only entity that by law brings together NSA and CISA and FBI and Cybercom. So all on one platform to work together on cyber defense operations and planning. And because that was instantiated in statute, that is also another mechanism to bring us together so that we are facing off as one cohesive entity to our international partners, to the private sector. And so that's been super helpful as well.
Hi there, I'm Brian Metzger with Insider.
Hi.
Wanted to ask you about TikTok, because those of us who cover Congress, we've been talking about it a lot. I understand that you've said that you're supportive of banning TikTok. I'm wondering, how much of a threat would you rate TikTok as? Is this something we should be mildly concerned about or extremely concerned about? And, generally speaking, do you think that Congress is focusing too much on this one app to the detriment of a broader conversation about regulation around tech and social media?
Yeah. So I think it is a significant threat. I think anything where troves and troves of data, in particular data about kids, of the 150 million users in the US, I don't know how many of them are kids, but I would suspect a good portion. I do think we need to be concerned about that, just because certainly we know how China operates as a foreign adversary. And so I am concerned. I've been on the record about this. I think to the second part of your question, I do think you're really onto something, and I've said this before. In some ways, TikTok is a tactical issue, and I am trying to get progress that really we talked about in the Foreign Affairs article, to look at the bigger issues around this. And I'll kind of break some down. I'll talk about China in a sec, but more broadly, you mentioned technology and regulation. So when you think about the past 50 years, right? You think about the invention of the internet. The internet was never created with safety or security in mind. It was this great thing that was going to connect us all, but security was an afterthought. And here we've got this place, which is a pretty dangerous neighborhood, frankly, to operate on. And then you had the rise of software, right? Software was going to be this great productivity boon, and we're all using it. But software was, all the incentives in software were about speed to market and cost. They were not about security or safety. So now we're like bolting on security, and when you bolt things on, you add complexity, and complexity prevails against security. So, we've developed this multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry because technology was not created safe. And then we had this world of social media, where we were all about moving fast and breaking things, and that was going to bring the world together. And I have a bit of a focus on mental health. And if you see some of the studies now about the impact of social media on the mental health of kids, in particular girls. And now here we are in the next phase where we're hurtling towards the implementation of AI in an accelerated way, and we're not thinking, I think, as much about the safety, the downstream safety consequences. And when you think about it, the most powerful technology of the last century was arguably nuclear weapons. The most powerful technology of this century is artificial intelligence. Nuclear weapons were built by governments that had the incentive to keep them safe. The incentives of those building AI is all about maximization of profit and business competition. So I think we need a serious discussion about how to realign incentives for the technology that essentially underpins everything that we rely upon every day. And that's that is not a trivial conversation. I've listened to people say, okay, well, as long as we get the regulation right for AI, but like the magic pixie dust of regulation, it's actually very difficult to do that. And so to me, that is one of the most important conversations that we need to be having about technology and AI in particular. It was sort of behind the letter that came out last week asking for a pause and more research on large language models. And that didn't land very well because of the zeitgeist around this, but I do think it's something that I worry a lot about. On China more broadly, you know, there's a saying that sort of Russia is a hurricane and China is climate change. You know, China is the thing that I worry the most about. Because when you look at the lessons that we're learning from Ukraine and you think about the lessons that China is learning from Ukraine, they're not going to make the mistake of not going against our critical infrastructure. They're going to cost all that in when they decide to blockade the strait or invade Taiwan. And I think we can expect significant cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, whether that's pipelines or transportation or communication. And that's all about inducing societal panic. It's about delaying military mobilization. And I think we need to get in that mindset now. Now, humans, it's very hard for humans to think 10, 20 years in advance. We're all about today, tomorrow, maybe next week. And that's why it's really hard to kind of motivate the type of work that we all need to do across our nation to ensure that not only our critical infrastructure is resilient, but our people are resilient. Because you saw the reaction to Colonial Pipeline. I mean, that was ransomware that didn't even hit the actual pipeline. It was just on the IT, the business network. And that caused a huge issue across the country. And, you know, Eastern Seaboard gas shut down for 4 days. So you imagine that on a massive scale. The Chinese are looking, okay, that's a play we're going to make. And so I think we need to be very, very open-eyed about China's plans and how we need to be prepared for future use of our data, whether it's surveillance or future intrusions to allow for disruption or destruction. It's not very positive.
Hi, I'm Marietta with the Washington Post. You kind of answered my question a little bit on AI, but I think, right now, especially in the media, we're all like, wow, AI is so like accessible for everyone. And I think that's kind of making us miss the bigger points that you just brought up. So I think double part question, like what can we as media be paying attention to? Like what are the biggest threats you think that we are ignoring or that we should be like kind of focusing more on?
Yeah, I mean, I say China and emerging tech, so AI specifically. And the reason why you're seeing so much of this now is just over the past couple months, it has accelerated dramatically, right? We went from GPT 3.5 to GPT 4.0 that can pass the bar with like 88% or something. I think you only need 50% to pass the bar. I'm not a lawyer, but my husband is. And so you can see just this accelerated pace. And there are some really cool things that can be done with this technology, but we don't fully understand what the safety ramifications are. So, I spent a lot of time in cyber in my career, but I also spent a lot of time doing counterterrorism. So I was in Iraq twice, in Afghanistan, and I was the deputy for counterterrorism at the National Security Agency and the head of counterterrorism in the Obama White House during ISIS. And when, AI capabilities don't really have much control over them, they can be weaponized by bad people for cyber, for genetic engineering, for bioweapons. And so just as they can be used for good, they can be used for really, really bad things by really bad people. And so I think getting more knowledgeable on this whole area around AI safety and ethics, look at DeepMind. There's a lot of good writing out there. Eliezer Yudovsky, Bostrom, Gary Marcus has a lot out there. So, I think these are the I would be very happy to be wrong, by the way. But, I grew up in the shadow of, when I was probably your guys' age, I was the, during 9/11, I was teaching up at West Point, and then I was working for Condi Rice, working with her during the 9/11 commission hearing. And I remember very vividly what Tom Kane, who was the vice chairman of the 9/11 Commission, said. He said, we were not prepared for a threat that had been growing. It was a failure of management, a failure of capability, a failure of policy, but above all, a failure of imagination. And in some ways, I think you all have the very difficult mission to be able to shine a light on things so that we can not suffer those same failures of imagination. And so I think that kind of accountability of corporations as well as the government is really, really important.
Hi, I'm Riley with the Anchorage Daily News. Working for a local outlet, I'm thinking a lot about local communities. You mentioned talking to mayors and governors. I'm curious what local communities should be thinking about when it comes to cybersecurity, and how worried should they be about cybersecurity threats?
Yeah. So everybody has to have an awareness of threats. I think when we talk about like fear and worry, I don't like to cast it in those terms, because when people get really scared, their brain sort of shuts down and they want to go focus on something else. So I look at this as sort of education, right? How do you educate and equip people to protect themselves online, whether they're kids or my 90-year-old mom, because there's a lot of scams and elder care, or communities. We've seen municipalities locked up. We've seen schools. We've seen hospitals. And so two things. We are spending a lot of time focused on what I call target-rich cyber poor entities. And those are some that have been targeted aggressively by ransomware, or some that we really feel are at risk. So in particular, K through 12 schools, hospitals, public utilities, in particular water, and then working with election officials to ensure that they have what they need to build resilience into their system. And we have a lot of no-cost services and a big field force that we've grown over the past couple of years. So we are out in cities, towns, municipalities, working with officials, working with local communities, with school superintendents and principals, with hospital administrators, to help them understand the basics of what they need to do to drive down risk. And we talk about like 4 things that you need to do just as an individual, but it's extensible if you're a small business. And that's number 1, implement multi-factor authentication, which, who has MFA? Everybody? Yeah, you don't get me started. Anyway, yes, so you should. Although you can still get it, just use an authentication app. Yeah, it doesn't, and you don't, it's easier to use an SMS, but just download an auth app, and everybody do that. It'll make me feel better, like this was worth my time. Just kidding. So enable multi-factor authentication. It could be SMS, it could be an authentication app, it could be a security key. It really depends on what your threat model is. And as you guys spend more time in this field, I would argue that your threat model is probably on the medium, depending if you go overseas, if you're a correspondent. it becomes more high risk. So all of you should actually learn, make sure you know how to protect yourself. So enabling MFA, always updating your software. It's very annoying to get those updates all the time, but you have to do it because it's not just, here's another game that we've just updated. Actually, they're telling you to update it because there's a glitch in the code that they've discovered, which means that a bad actor can get in. It's a vulnerability that they're patching. Password keepers, who's got password keepers? Okay, go on consumer reports. There's a whole bunch of different types of password keepers. You should get one. You should have complex, unique passwords, and you should keep them in a password keeper because it's really easy. They'll generate it for you. It makes it very easy to fill it in. And mindful of phishing, something else you all should be aware of as well, like training on phishing and keeping your spam filters really high. Because of tools like AI, actors can get better and better at creating spam emails because they're socially engineered to focus on being something that you would recognize and think, oh, that comes from my friend or that comes from my mom. And so you have to be super, super careful. I'm not going to tell you don't click on links because the entire internet is links, but being really mindful of that. So like 4 very basic things that you can do to really drive down risk, and those are the kind of conversations we have in communities. But a lot of what we try and do is to reach down to the local level because, frankly, that's where folks can tend to be the most vulnerable because they don't have the resources of a big company like the one I used to work for, right? There's in small businesses, which I think are 99.9% of the economy, 33.2 million small businesses, and the median size is 11 people. So the HR person is the finance person, is the IT person, and you have to manage all of that. So we try and make it as easy as possible. And if you all haven't had a chance to go on our website, CISA.gov, it's got a lot of this type of information about how to keep yourself safe online, how to protect yourself. So super important.
I'm Eleanor Mueller. I cover congressional economics for Politico, and the U.S. right now does not have a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency. The House Financial Services Chair has said now that he wants to pass a stablecoins bill and a market structure bill by the summer. Should cybersecurity be part of that conversation? And if so, have you been involved in those talks at all?
No, not at all. Where we look at things like crypto exchanges, a lot of them have been hacked. I just think broadly, cybersecurity needs to be part of every conversation. With the infrastructure bill that was passed, we're taking the opportunity to ensure that as we implement, as we put in place, as we develop new infrastructure, that we're always thinking about implementing cybersecurity in mind. It kind of goes back to my earlier point about technology. If technology is underpinning all aspects of critical infrastructure, it's really the place that I think we need to focus most. When a company has a breach, everybody's quick to say, oh, that company's all screwed up and the share price drops and you fire your CISO and all of this stuff happens. But, oftentimes it's because you have technology that you've bought that is full of vulnerabilities. And what we're trying to really focus on is making sure that technology, to include technology that underpins cryptocurrency exchanges, is secure by design. So designed to be secure and secure by default. So think about it in a car. You wouldn't buy a car that came without seatbelts or airbags or crumple zones or anti-lock brakes. Our technology should come with things like MFA baked in, so we don't have to worry about I've got to set MFA up. It should all come in the tech, so I don't have to teach my 90-year-old mom how to keep herself. You still want to know basics, but at the end of the day, that's where I would want to see congressional focus if I was, in charge for a day.
Hi, I'm Arthur with ABC News. I cover education, and you mentioned something that I'm looking at right now. How should school districts protect themselves from cyber attacks? And should that include social media, especially TikTok, but not including TikTok because there's so much going on with social media and kids right now?
Yeah. Where we're focused, and I would, there's a report that we did, and we're happy to send it to you. It's got a very long title, but it basically is protecting K through 12 from cyber threats. So there was a congressional act that basically asked us to do a survey of what was happening across the K through 12 space, and then work with that community to come up with a toolkit to help them drive down risk. So we worked on it for about a year or so, worked with a lot of really good nonprofits, and worked with IT administrators across the country, and came out with this guide, which is very basic because that's another example of target-rich, cyber-poor. And so we want to be able to help them do the 5 or 6 things that they need to do to drive down risk to their networks and their systems and all of that. So I would check that out. I actually just brought onto my advisory board a guy called Doug Levin, who is the executive director of what's called K-12-6, which focuses across the country on IT best practices for driving down risk on K through 12 networks. And so the feedback we've gotten on that is already really good. But what we're trying to do now is to reach out and be very high touch about it to K through 12 districts across the country, and sit down with the IT directors and say, what can we do to help you? Here are some free services. We have vulnerability scanning. We do assessments, both from a cyber perspective, but also importantly from a physical perspective. So, given we also at CISA have the school safety program. So we're looking at physical as well as cybersecurity. And so we're trying to take a holistic, kind of what I'd call converged approach to how we keep our schools safe. But I would definitely check out that guide because I think it's really good. And if you talk to a lot of these communities, I would help us get that guide out there because it was developed to help them drive down risk.
Hi, I'm Jillian. I'm with the Sacramento Bee in McClatchy. Similar to the last question, I cover part of California where there's only one hospital, and so I'm wondering about, similarly to education, how should healthcare facilities also implement that, especially when they're really underfunded and cover a huge swath of rural folks.
Yeah, 100%. So this is one of the reasons why we chose hospitals, because they are another perfect example, target-rich, cyber-poor. And as you point out, if you have to make a decision between upgrading your software and getting another doctor, it's pretty obvious what you're going to do. And so HHS is, of course, the Sector Risk Management Agency. So they bring the healthcare expertise and we bring the cyber expertise. So we're working with them to come together to do sort of joint visits to hospitals across the country and to focus on, again, like what are the basic things that they need to be doing to drive down risk and to also help support the poor IT teams and security teams that oftentimes are not prioritized. And so that's kind of one of the things behind our corporate cyber responsibility. It's also getting leaders of some of these other entities to really appreciate how important it is for them to be able to secure their networks, because we've seen surgeries canceled, we've seen patients diverted. And so I think people are recognizing that it's important, but they don't necessarily have the resources. So we have a bunch of free resources. We got together with the private sector. If you look on our Shields Up webpage, the private sector came together with a ton of their free resources, free services, so that can be used by hospitals. So we're sitting down with them, we're having the conversation so that we can understand where they're at from a baseline, and then help them implement the most important things so that they can drive down risk to their networks. But super important. We actually brought somebody onto our board who's the CEO of Atlantic Health to help us do that, to help us advise. And he had experienced a ransomware incident. And so he really felt very passionate about working with these hospitals so that they could be better prepared.
Hi, Hugo Lowe with The Guardian. I have several questions, but I wanted to first touch on TikTok. And why is TikTok any more of an issue than something like Twitter, given, Twitter has Saudi, Qatari, Emirati sovereign wealth fund ownership, and Elon Musk's decision to release kind of the fire hose of traffic data to his owners, to kind of potential foreign governments and potential adversaries. Why is TikTok and Twitter not the same issue?
Yeah, I have not heard that any of the data from US companies like Twitter is going back to foreign adversaries. In terms of them being able to store US persons' data, okay, I didn't see that. I'm happy to follow up on that. But we know that this data is going back to China, and we know China is an adversary nation that has done things with our data, both for espionage, for counterintelligence, for profiling. We also know that every intrusion into data can give a foothold, not necessarily for TikTok, but certainly in terms of the overall plan on critical infrastructure for disruption and destruction. And so I am much more concerned about China, given they are very clearly an adversary and are, preeminent threat to our national security. I am less concerned about the other countries that you mentioned.
I understand. And then kind of pivoting a little bit, I was just kind of curious, since you took over at CISA, I was wondering if you could give an overview of what your kind of day-to-day looks like. Different directors have different priorities and schedules, and, Director Krebs had his way of doing things. And I was kind of wondering if you'd give an overview of maybe your day, who you speak to the most on a kind of interagency basis. And then specifically with respect to elections, I was wondering maybe if you could give an overview of kind of how you approach maybe the midterm, since that's over now.
Yeah. So Chris was here when there was COVID, so I think there was a big difference between that. But also, he had the very difficult mission, first of all, to actually stand at the agency. But he came at a time when elections had just been designated as critical infrastructure. And I don't know if you've ever talked to him about it, but when that occurred, state and local were, to say the least, not happy about it. So they actually, I think, put out a resolution saying, we don't want the federal government anywhere near our elections. And of course, state and local officials run elections and administer them. The federal government does not administer elections. The federal government was only designated that so that election officials could have the resources and the capabilities and the intel they needed. So Chris spent a huge amount of time building trusted partnerships with state and local election officials, and he did a superb job, such that when I came in July of 2021, I inherited these fantastic partnerships, and he's a wonderful friend. So my day is a lot of spent with external folks outside the government. We'll have at the operational level, I think, my teams would tell you they spend significant amount of time with FBI, with NSA, time with Cybercom, time with the other SRMAs, whether that's Energy or Treasury or HHS or EPA, but a lot of time with industry partners from all the critical infrastructure sectors, as well as the folks who, if there's a specific thing we're working on, this latest 3XX CX, for example, recent sort of cyber issue that came up with that company. We'll spend a lot of time with researchers, because researchers are really, really valuable in sort of understanding what's happening across the threat intel system. So, for me personally, just to give you an idea, so I'm with you all this morning. I'm with about 10 chief information security officers across the defense industrial base. Later this afternoon, I'm doing a mentoring call with somebody I used to work with at Morgan Stanley, doing another external engagement. So my day is very much about working with our partners to understand what they need from us, and to continue to get their feedback and to build that trust. And that's something that uniquely I can do as the head of CISA. And I come from a background that's like super operational, but at this level, I'm not doing a lot of operations, because I've got great people deep in the weeds of the technical weeds of operations. But yeah, that's a typical day. I get in between 6 and 6:30, and probably get home between 7 and 8 or so. So, but you know, it's actually super fun. This is the most fun job I've ever had.
And just lastly, kind of how involved was CISA with something like, the department and the bureau's action against Hive or like ransomware and kind of seizures in that, because that seemed to be predominantly a bureau-led.
Yeah. So we were very involved in the notification piece of that. So we work, Brian Vordran, who's the assistant director for cyber, works very closely with Eric Goldstein, who's my head of cyber. And whenever we do notifications to potential victims or actual victims, we do it together. So it's a kind of a joint outreach to notify, in particular, if it's critical infrastructure. So the team actually did a bunch of work, I think, to help distribute the effort on that. But I love what FBI has been doing. They're terrific partners. We work hugely closely together, and we very much complement each other. I often get the question about, who does what, and is it competitive? And frankly, those relationships are great because it's very clear. FBI does law enforcement and investigation. NSA does foreign intel collection. We do cyber defense, right? CNMF and Cybercom do offensive cyber operations. So we actually work together in a really cohesive and productive way that I've been super encouraged about.
Kirsten Garris. I work for Cox Media Group, so local TV. So going back to education, I know we had a couple of stations in like Massachusetts and Pittsburgh area that had swatting calls. So these fake calls that were calling in active shooters, and obviously the districts responded. And it came right after the heels of what happened in Nashville. So people were very much, we want to make sure we're there, but nothing, thank God there was no threat. What is your agency doing to kind of help school districts with that kind of threat where it isn't necessarily their infrastructure per se, or, how do you tackle something like that where these calls are growing? I know last year there were dozens of calls across the country and the calls sounded the same as they kind of went out. So how do you handle that? And can Congress even do anything? Would you want to see Congress step in on something like this, even though schools are usually a state issue, but this is related to security?
Yeah, I mean, to your last question, I don't know if there's a role for Congress in this. I don't think I necessarily want them to step in. But with respect to what we do in situations like that, so, CISA became an operational component, its own agency, because of the need to build capacity in cybersecurity. But we still have a physical security mission. So we do school safety, we do exercises, we have an Office of Bombing Prevention, and we do school shooter training and physical assessments, all that stuff. So things like that happening, what we would be doing is working with our law enforcement partners. We've done a series of webinars. We've also done a series of visits. You remember the bombing threats to HBCUs last year. So we did outreach to all of the HBCUs about how you react to a situation like that, how you might react if that bomb threat was real, how you react to an active shooter situation. It's a lot about building resilience. So we will respond if we're asked to respond, but we are much more what I'd call left of boom. We're about all of the best practices and things that we can put in place to enable resilience and preparation for threats like that. But it's been very helpful to have, to be building a cyber capability and to have a physical capability because, threats are very converged these days. You have to worry about cyber threats as well as physical threats. And so having a more holistic approach, I think, is the right thing for the country.
Follow up. I feel like when we talk about cybersecurity in the media, it's because something went wrong. And, you're reacting to this incident happen. In your experience over the past few years, have you seen things like what's going well in terms of cybersecurity? What are the things that you're like, okay, people are taking this seriously in this sector?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I guess I'd point to two things. First of all, people really loved our Shields Up campaign. Does anyone ever pick up on that? Okay, you didn't love it, but other people did. So I'm a big Star Trek fan, and I was trying to come up with like a rallying cry for people to start preparing and be vigilant to potential Russian attacks against critical infrastructure. So we started the Shields Up campaign. It did get a lot of traction. One of the things that I've been told by CEOs is that really helped put people on notice, so they needed to start making those investments. And in some cases, it accelerated their ability to get their networks in better shape, more secure, more resilient. And so, a good example of how we can be effective left of boom to get the country mobilized through threat briefings and putting out information and free services. So, one good example. The second is pretty cool. We put out a blog last week, and it was picked up in CNN, about a new program that we started, pre-ransomware notifications, which is really terrific. So we have a lot of great relationships with threat researchers, with industry folks that can see malware being deployed. Now, there's usually hours to days before that malware is activated and used to encrypt or used to steal data. And so we will get a tip, and then we'll use our field force to call that entity and to tell them, hey, you have malware on your networks, you need to isolate it in order to mitigate that. So we've made, over the last 6 months or so, we've made about 100 of those notifications, and dozens of them, with the feedback we've gotten, we've actually prevented businesses from getting locked up with ransomware, which is like a great day, right? When you can call a university or call a business and actually prevent them from having to go through the anxiety and the stress of dealing with a ransomware attack. So, that's a good thing. So helping people at the end of the day, having a positive impact on people's lives, that's super cool.
Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us.
Yeah.